The chapel is not how I remember it. All these years I've imagined a simple wooden room buried deep in the hospital. Instead, light shines through a splendid stained-glass window onto an altar with an embroidered cloth and large brass candlesticks. It feels like a church. I asked the chaplain if everything looks the same as it would have done when I was here over 20 years ago. We've had a new carpet, she tells me, and pink covers for the seats, though soot blows down from the roof, so I'm always out here with a little hoover. There is a smallish tree to one side of the room with a blue and white cuddly elephant propped against the base and bits of coloured paper clipped among its leaves. That's newer, the chaplain says, a prayer tree. That won't have been here when you were. I walk over to it and gently take one of the leaves between my thumb and forefinger, plastic but convincing from a distance. I read the messages written on the bits of paper. This must make it easier for atheists, I think. Far easier as an atheist in extremis to write something down and attach it to a tree than to kneel in front of an altar and try to work out how to make a deity you don't believe in listen to what you have to say. Some of the messages are addressed to God, some to the living, some to the dead. There's a range of handwriting styles, differing levels of ease with grammar and spelling. It's the badly punctuated ones that I find most poignant. I imagine they demanded the most effort. Some are in a spindly, elderly hand, others in childish, rounded letters. I hope the baby is all right when you have it. 15 years and I miss you like yesterday. Dear God, thank you for listening. Please pray for my little brother, love you loads, little buddy. For my dearest, greatly missed daughter, she died 25th of October 83. I have never got over it. Pray for us all. I pause, lost in these hints and echoes of other people's stories, other people's love, and then I wonder what I would have written if this tree had been in place when I stumbled in here on my way from intensive care to the relative's overnight room. I know what I wanted then, but how would I have found the words? To whom would I have addressed my plea? Please don't let my brother die. Dear God, please don't let my brother die. Please pray for my brother, I don't want him to die. Don't die, Matty, please don't die. The years collapse and I see myself kneeling and crying and begging with my hands clasped together in prayer, talking to some unknown force. Please don't let him die. Please don't let him die. I'll do anything, only please don't let him die. What strikes me now, as it never has before, is that I can't say my prayers went unanswered. I was given what I asked for. My brother did not die. But I did not know then that I was praying for the wrong thing. I did not know then that there is a world between the certainties of life and death, that it is not simply the case of one or the other, and that there are many and various fates worse than death. That is what separates the me standing here now by the prayer tree from the girl kneeling in front of the altar all those years ago. She thought she was living the worst night of her life, but I know that far worse was to come. The thing she feared was that her brother would die, but I know now it would have been better for everyone if he had. It would have been better for everyone if, as she knelt here, begging for his life, his heart had ceased to beat, if the LED spikes on the monitors had turned into a flat line, if death had been pronounced, accepted, dealt with. It would have been so much better if Matty had died then. She was praying for the wrong thing. I was praying for the wrong thing.
Well, Cathy, thanks for joining us. The passage that you just read is the opening passage of the book, and it's obviously an incredibly powerful and immediately confessional and emotionally honest passage. And the book that follows is the story of what happened to your brother and the impact his accident had on your life and the lives of your family. Can you tell us briefly about what happened on that terrible night?
Well, he was walking home from a disco near our house, and he was knocked over by a car. And I was at home. We lived in a pub in Yorkshire. Somebody came round to the back of the pub and managed to get my attention and said, "Does Matthew Minton live here?" And I said, "Yes, I'm his sister." And they said, "Oh, you better come then, he's in trouble." And I thought that trouble, I had no idea what that meant or what had actually happened, so I didn't wake my parents up. I just went with this man in his car, and then I got to the road and my brother was lying in the road. And then shortly after that, an ambulance arrived, and I realised how serious it was because of the way the ambulance men were behaving. And I just didn't have the beginnings of the experience of anything like this. It had never really occurred to me that anything like this could happen to him or to us. And he was transferred to Leeds General Infirmary, and they operated on him. He had a very severe head injury, and then I remember the surgeon said to my dad, "I've saved your son's life, but we don't know whether or not that was the right thing to do." And then he just never got better.
Well, the book is probably the most sustained examination of grief and the different forms that grief takes that I've ever read, and particularly the sort of contrary emotions that it throws up. There's one striking passage where you list all the reasons you feel guilty, and at one point you were saying, "Well, I feel guilty for feeling this, but then I feel guilty for not feeling this," and it never quite.
You feel guilty for being happy and guilty for not being happy enough.
Yeah. There are times in the book where I, as a reader, have always think, wow, you've turned the page now. You know, this stage of your life's happened, this stage of your life has happened, but the memories, terrible memories of what happened to Matty keep sort of dragging you back. So how much do you still live with that grief?
Well, I think writing the book's been very helpful, and because what I've realised is, I think before I always thought that I had to... in some way get over it. So one of the things I felt guilty about is I felt guilty that I couldn't get over it. But then I also felt guilty that I would ever be able to get over it. Whereas now I don't feel I have to get over it. I feel that it's actually, you know, I witnessed terrible suffering of someone I really loved. I'll always feel sad about that. But actually what I've learnt to do is I've learnt to accommodate it into my life, and that's so much better. And I feel frankly amazing, way beyond kind of what I expected to feel, because I think I thought I would always feel, you know, a bit miserable. But actually I feel great, and I kind of have woven it all together. And it's been very brilliant talking to other people, because I found out that actually that is how other people feel. And other people feel very relieved. I see it, it's like a light bulb goes on behind their eyes. When I say, like, oh, I've just realised I have to stop worrying that one day I will be fixed and obsessing about that happening. And I see other people that go, maybe that could be the same for me. And so I think it's actually quite a powerful thing that we could all feel.
Yeah, it's okay to feel this way. Because you talk about a toxic narrative, that you know, there's some people who have a toxic narrative. The concept of you know, people out there carrying this in them and then finding the means of releasing this toxic narrative. What do you mean by a toxic narrative, and how did you find the courage to deal with your own?
Well, it was really in writing the book that I realised that was what was going on with me, and I realised it really, I think, again, through starting to talk to other people and seeing what was happening with them. And I realised that lots of people, I hesitate to say all of us, but I think a lot of us are walking around with a sort of a sad, difficult story that we retell ourselves. You know, it defines us. We don't want it to, and we retell it to ourselves. And I think it can be anything, really. I've spoken to someone who told me that he still feels just really sad and angry about being sent away to school when he was 12. And in that moment, this person telling me was in late middle age, and in that moment I just saw all this pain and anger in his eyes. And obviously there'll be other bits to that story. There'll be bits, you know, it's an incomplete story, but that's his thing. And then I've realised there's a very good book called Instrumental by James Rhodes, and he talks about, you know, he was abused as a child. And I think, again, that's another toxic narrative. And I think often with the toxic narrative, it will be all confused, but it will sort of include grief, though not necessarily for a loved one. It could be grief for, like, a loss of innocence. But it will include grief, and it seems to also include guilt.
Tom mentioned the word confessional earlier on, and you're very open and very generous in what you share with the reader. You talk about not knowing how to talk about Matty, your brother, and the situation, so you devise other means of protecting yourself and avoiding having to go through that narrative. And when you were in France, you passed yourself off as an only child. Looking back on it, did it work? Did it make you feel better?
Well, it saves the short-term problem. The problem is then you have to explain to people, and that's what I really hated. People
you had the little graph of all the different possible responses.
People say, have you got any brothers and sisters? And then it's like, And what I really hated was sometimes I would be trying to explain it. And the thing is, what happened to Matthew is very complex and difficult. It's not something you can explain in a sentence. And I would be explaining it, and sometimes I'd see in somebody's eyes they were thinking, like, oh God, I only asked if she had any siblings, I didn't expect this, you know.
Now what?
And that's really horrible when you just realise you're inflicting this awful story on other people. But again, lying about it just does make you feel terrible, because it's quite biblical, isn't it? You feel like you've denied
somebody's existence.
So that is just awful, a terrible thing. And then it's quite interesting, because of course as you get older people ask about siblings less. It's quite interesting now, because obviously now people often talk to me about it, and I really like talking about it. I still don't really like telling people. If I meet somebody who knows I've written a book but doesn't know what it's about, I still hate that moment where they've said, because I'm quite a jolly person. I'll be sitting next to someone at lunch and someone will say, like, oh, your book's going very well. And the other person will say, what's your book about? And I just have that same utterly sinking feeling that I'm about to make everybody else feel miserable. and this happened to me last night, and I said, oh, it's quite a big subject. I might, let's just carry on telling jokes for the time being,
Okay, move along now, nothing to see.
The title of the book is obviously The Last Act of Love. And the phrase "last act of love" refers to the decision, the eventual tragic decision to withdraw Matty's hydration and nutrition and allow him to die. And it's taken from your mother's written submission to the courts, which ruled in favour of allowing you to do this. How long did it take you and the rest of your family to see this course of action as, quote, an act of love, rather than, say, betrayal or murder? These are all thoughts you've struggled with, up until that point.
I mean, I think my mother always very clearly saw it as an act of love, and I think I did at the time, obviously, but I think it was actually more afterwards that I became very confused by it. And I think it's what I've realised now by looking at it all again. I've realised that it seems so profoundly wrong at a kind of a societal level, at an emotional level. It seems so profoundly wrong to desire the death of someone that you love. And that did make me feel like a murderer. But actually what I've realised now is it was right to desire his death because it was the situation he was in that was unnatural and wrong.
Absolutely.
And that's the problem, really. So as our society, we're now capable medically of keeping people alive in terrible states, but we haven't ethically caught up with that. So nobody really knows what to do with it. And what I now think of is the way I think I now responded to it in quite a normal way.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, the decision to withdraw hydration and nutrition and are as a result of the legal restrictions on euthanasia and assisted dying, which is obviously a very, very live political issue. You read about it every day. And given what you've been through in the process of writing this book, have you come to any firm conclusions about that within your own mind?
It's such a difficult and complex area, and I don't ever, to be honest, want to be reduced to that idea of, like I've called for this or I want that. But I do think what I hope about my book is I think if I could have read my book all those years ago, I think it would have been immeasurably helpful for me. So I do hope that the fact that my book exists, the fact that there is now a record of what it feels like to have to watch that happen to someone, what it feels like to have to suffer that for 8 years, what it feels like to have to write down that you want the person you love to die and go to a court and swear it, and then what it feels like to suffer the 13 days whilst that person dies, because I see the legal bit of that, because it has to be a withdrawal rather than an intervention. And that to me seems frankly insane, because we extend more courtesy to pets and people on death row than we do in those circumstances.
No, absolutely. I mean, I found those 13 days quite harrowing. This anticipation, the doctor's giving you one idea of how long it's going to take. It does not. There are no rules.
No, because nobody really knows. Ours was the fourth legal case, so it wasn't the fault of any of the doctors involved. It's that nobody really knew. They go to such due diligence during the court case, and I really think somebody in that situation, I don't really see why a morphine injection or something would be a terrible thing to do, because really the thing. And it's very difficult in these situations. But the way I look at it now is, my brother didn't die on the night he was knocked over, but it would have been better for everybody if he did, including him. But then, although we couldn't do this at the time, I think people in that situation, they sort of have to accept that person is gone. After you would still want to hope and try for some period, but then you have to accept that however tragic it is and how much you love them, that person is now gone, and you have to think about the rest of the family. And I think the collateral damage to people who are involved in this sort of situation is incredible. And even since people have started to know about my book, people are sending me messages who are in the same situation, and I can't tell you how it destroys me to think that there are children having to visit their parents in this situation. Because I have a 5-year-old boy, and the thought of my 5-year-old boy being taken to visit me in that condition, or me taking him to visit his father in that condition, that's just terrible.
At what point did you feel that you said goodbye to Matty? At what point during the 8 years or after?
That's such a good question. I mean, are we convinced that I have?
No, that's true.
Well,
I'm not convinced I have. I do feel sort of stuck. I think something about the profoundly drawn out nature of it. Again, I absolutely know that if he died on that night, I wouldn't be here now. So I'm not convinced actually that I don't know, have I said goodbye to him? One of the beautiful things about writing the book is I now feel I have him back and I can remember him again, whereas he was buried under those awful 8 years. Whereas now he's very sort of close to me, and I remember him in like the fullness of his brilliant personality, a quite sort of naughty personality. So he virtually kind of pops up in my head now, often giving me quite sort of inflammatory advice. If I'm worried about what to do in a situation, and then he's sort of there in my head saying, like, what are you worried about that for?
The book is very much a story of what happened to your brother and your family, but it's also very much a love story about your brother. You two were so close. And the last line in the book, and this is for the listeners out there, the last line in the book will leave you sobbing, but it only has its impact when you read the entire book. It just set me off. But I'm also curious, so my final question is, did you collect Matty's ashes? Where are his ashes?
They're still in Yorkshire, in the undertakers where they've always been. I feel they're very safe there, and I do want to collect them. And I just don't want to rush it.
Yes.
But I'm going to collect them, and I have various ideas about how I'm going to do that and what we're going to do. And I think that possibly that might enable me to feel a little bit more like I'm saying goodbye.
Well, I think we speak for everyone who reads the book that it's a really, really wonderful memoir and a wonderful tribute to your late brother, Matty. So, Cathy, thanks very much for joining us. The Last Act of Love is out on July the 2nd, and you can buy a copy in the Reader's Digest store, and it is also our recommended read in the July issue of the magazine.